The man walked into the bank, his steps measured and deliberate, his dark tailored suit fitting him perfectly as he approached the counter, his posture calm and assured. He exuded an air of quiet confidence. But the young white teller barely glanced up from her computer screen. Her eyes flickered toward him for a second before she quickly returned to the task at hand. In her mind, he was just another customer, probably there for a routine transaction. She didn't see anything special about him as he stood in front of the counter, her mind already focused on the next customer she needed to serve. He could feel her judgment, even though it wasn't overt, the way her eyes subtly appraised him, and how her fingers tapped quickly against the keyboard as if eager to get through the interaction. He cleared his throat gently to draw her attention, but she didn't seem to notice. Instead, she muttered a quick greeting without meeting his gaze. Her tone was curt and mechanical, like it was just another job. He was another name to be processed through the system without a second thought. She didn't ask for his name or offer any small pleasantries, and when he spoke to her to clarify his request, her response was just as quick and dismissive. She assumed he was here for something minor, probably just depositing a check or taking out a few $100, nothing worth paying extra attention to. He tried to keep his frustration in check as he spoke, but her attitude toward him stung. Despite her polite facade, she treated him as if he didn't belong here at this bank, as if his presence was just an inconvenience in her busy day. He kept his voice even and steady, asking for a service that required more attention than a simple deposit, but she didn't seem to care. In fact, her focus never wavered from her screen as she mechanically processed his request. Her disinterest only grew as he mentioned specific details. She clearly didn't want to listen to her. Interruptions came quickly. She cut him off without letting him finish, and when she did speak, it was with a condescending tone, her words thinly veiled in impatience, as if he were the one causing delays. She gave him no space to explain or clarify. She assumed he didn't know what he was talking about, as if someone who looked like him could never understand the more complex aspects of banking. She carried herself with a quiet superiority born of assumptions and stereotypes. So far, he said nothing. He stayed patient, waiting for her to catch up to the conversation, waiting for her to realize that his request was more than reasonable. His thoughts remained calm, even as the moments dragged on, but the weight of her judgment pressed down on him. He could feel the heat of embarrassment and indignation stirring inside of him, but he refused to let it show. He had faced these kinds of assumptions all his life, being treated like he didn't belong or that his presence didn't matter. It wasn't new to him, but it always stung. This time, though, something was different. Maybe it was the repeated dismissals, maybe it was the way she didn't take the time to even ask him what he really needed. But the moment seemed to crystallize in his mind, the realization of how quickly people could be reduced to nothing more than the surface assumptions that society placed on them. He wasn't sure how long this would continue, but he knew one thing for certain: his patience was wearing thin. The man remained composed as the teller continued her hasty work, not bothering to look him in the eye or treat him with any sort of respect. Her actions were a sharp contrast to the quiet confidence he radiated as he stood before her. Despite everything, he felt a strange calmness settle over him. He had grown accustomed to this sort of treatment, the dismissive attitude, the condescending tone, the way people assumed they could talk down to him, but today it felt different. There was something almost deliberate in the way she ignored him, the way she rushed through his request without considering that he might have a legitimate reason for wanting something more than a simple transaction. He began to wonder if it was his presence or his appearance that bothered her the most, or if it was simply his mere existence in this space that made her uncomfortable. He had seen the way people looked at him before, the quick glances, the subtle judgments that told him he didn't belong, and yet he always carried himself with the same level of dignity and grace, because he knew that the moment he let others dictate his actions, they would win. They would succeed in making him feel small. They would succeed in making him believe their assumptions about him. He wasn't going to let that happen today. He had already been judged simply by walking in the door. He had been judged by his clothes, by his skin, by the way he carried himself. The teller had already decided what kind of man he was, and it wasn't the kind who deserved anything more than the bare minimum. the kind who didn't need any extra attention, the kind who could be rushed through the system without second thoughts. She had already labeled him in her mind, and in that instant she became the embodiment of everything he had worked so hard to rise above. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she didn't bother to look up, in the way she seemed so uninterested in engaging with him. He wasn't just another customer to him. This was a moment of truth, a moment where he would have to make a choice. How far would he let her push him? How long could he remain patient before he reached the limit of his tolerance? Part of him wanted to speak out, part of him wanted to call attention to her behavior and demand an apology, but another part of him knew that this wasn't the moment for that. It wasn't worth it. He didn't need to prove anything to her. He didn't need to react to her disrespect with the same aggression she had thrown his way. Instead, he continued to wait silently, allowing the seconds to tick by, her hasty typing and the rustling of paper filling the otherwise quiet room. But the longer it went on, the more he realized how deeply ingrained these assumptions were, how little effort some people were willing to make to see beyond their narrow view of the world, how quickly they decided who was worthy and who wasn't. He couldn't change her views with a few words. He couldn't make her understand what it felt like to be judged based on nothing more than the way he looked, but he could make a decision today not to let her words or actions define him, not to let her assumptions shape his worth. He didn't need her validation. He already knew who he was, and he knew where he stood, but she would never know that, not yet anyway. He wondered if she ever would. As the man stood there waiting, he could feel the weight of the silence between them growing more pronounced each second. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, typing with such urgency that it was almost as if she wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible. The transaction was supposed to be simple and straightforward, but she made it feel like an inconvenience to her. Her eyes never once strayed from the screen, as if he were just another line of data to be processed. She didn't bother to look up at him, to acknowledge his presence, or make any attempt at engaging him beyond the bare minimum. Her voice was mechanical when she spoke, and her responses were clipped and curt, as if she were rushing him through the steps, as though she couldn't wait for him to be gone, as if he were just another customer in an endless sea of faceless individuals. He could sense the unspoken judgment that lingered in the air, the assumptions she had made about him, the way she had sized him up the moment he walked in the door. He wasn't in her world. He didn't belong here to her. He was just another person trying to take up space in a place where he clearly didn't fit. He knew that this wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything that came before it, the invisible walls that society had built around people like him, the ones who were constantly being measured by the color of their skin, or the way they dressed, or the way they spoke. But as he stood there, he realized that no matter how hard she tried to push him into a box, no matter how small she tried to make him feel, she couldn't touch the truth that he knew about himself. He was more than the assumptions she made. He was more than the stereotype she had decided to place him in. The reality was, he didn't need her approval to know who he was or what he had achieved. He had worked his entire life to build something that was his own, something that could never be taken from him just by the way he looked or the way someone decided to treat him. But the fact that this was still happening was a stark reminder of how far society still had to go, how quickly people could judge others without taking the time to see the full picture. He could feel his patience wearing thin. But he wasn't going to let her see that. He wasn't going to let her see how much her treatment was affecting him. He wasn't going to let her win by giving in to the frustration that was building inside of him. He had been dealing with this kind of ignorance for years, and it wasn't going to break him now. Instead, he chose to remain calm. He chose to stand there quietly, letting her make her mistakes without giving her the satisfaction of knowing how much they were bothering him. He could see the way her eyes flickered briefly to the screen when the system gave an alert, as if something had caught her off guard. But she quickly dismissed it and continued typing as if nothing had changed. He knew she hadn't yet realized what was in front of her. She hadn't yet understood who he was or the significance of his presence in this bank. But when she did, when the realization hit her, it would be too late. The damage would already be done, and her assumptions would be forever etched in the air between them. But for now, he stayed quiet. He stayed still, letting the moments pass until it was time for the truth to come out. He knew that one way or another things were about to change. The teller paused her typing. Suddenly her fingers froze as a notification flashed on her screen. She blinked quickly and leaned in closer to inspect the data on the screen. Her eyes widened slightly, and she leaned back in her chair. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing as she processed what she had just seen. The man's account details didn't match what she had expected. The account balance was far higher than she imagined, far higher than anything she had encountered in her daily work. She quickly scanned through the additional information, the details of his investments and financial influence within the bank. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized who he was. The realization hit her like a wave. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks as she tried to regain composure. Her mind was already racing through the implications of her mistake. She glanced up at him for the first time, fully seeing him now, her perception shifting in an instant. This was no ordinary customer. He wasn't just a man who had walked in off the street. He was a major investor, someone whose wealth and power far surpassed anything she had ever dealt with in her job. And in that moment her entire demeanor changed. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she scrambled to regain control of the situation. She had assumed so much based on his appearance, and she had been wrong in the worst possible way. She had misjudged him completely, but there was no going back now. The damage was done. The man had seen her treatment of him, and even if she apologized now, the air was thick with the unspoken truth. She had treated him with disrespect and arrogance without knowing who he was, and now she was scrambling to make it right in an instant. The polite formalities returned, her voice now laced with false sweetness. As she apologized for the misunderstanding, she spoke quickly and with too much enthusiasm, trying to mask the awkwardness of the situation. But her words felt hollow to her own ears. It wasn't enough to fix what had happened. The man had already seen through her false politeness. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew that if she had recognized him from the start, she would have treated him differently. He didn't need her apology or her hurried attempts to make amends. What he needed was for her to realize how dangerous and unfair it was to judge people based solely on their appearance. She had underestimated him in a way that was all too familiar to him. It wasn't the first time he had been treated this way, and it wouldn't be the last. But what he couldn't ignore was the fact that this time he had been judged and dismissed by someone who was supposed to be an authority figure, someone who worked in a place where respect and professionalism were supposed to be paramount. She had no idea who he was when he walked in, and she had made her assumptions based on nothing more than her limited perspective. But now she knew who he was. Now the power dynamic had shifted, and she was the one who had to live with the consequences of her own ignorance. He stayed silent as he watched her scramble, his gaze steady as she nervously shuffled papers and tapped on her keyboard. He didn't need to say anything more. Her own discomfort was telling enough. She knew what she had done. She knew that she had underestimated him, and she knew that it would be hard to ever regain the respect she had lost. But for him there was no need to respond. He didn't have to make a spectacle of it. He knew his worth, and in that moment her mistakes were all too clear. The teller's hands shook slightly as she tried to finish the transaction, her movements becoming erratic as she desperately tried to mask her discomfort. She continued, speaking in a voice that now lacked the confidence she had earlier. Her words seemed rehearsed and unnatural, as if she were trying too hard to cover up the awkwardness of the situation. But the man saw through it all. He could sense her unease, and it only made the situation more palpable. The tension in the air was thick with unspoken words and the weight of her mistake. He stood there silently watching her struggle to regain control of the situation. But in his mind, he wasn't sure there was a way to fix it. There was no way to undo the assumptions she had made about him, no way to erase the judgment she had passed without ever knowing who he was. He could see her eyes flicking back to the screen, to the information that now confirmed his identity and the real value of his account. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. It wasn't just a mistake of not recognizing him as an important figure. It was the deeper issue of how easily she had dismissed him in the first place, how quickly she had decided that he wasn't worth her attention. that his needs were just another inconvenience in her busy day. He had seen this before, this assumption that people who looked like him were not important, that their time didn't matter, and their business wasn't valuable enough to warrant respect. But this time it felt different, because it wasn't just a random encounter, it wasn't just some isolated case of ignorance. This time it had been deliberate, and he could feel the sting of that judgment as it lingered in the air between them. He didn't say anything he didn't need to. Her discomfort was enough to show that she understood the gravity of the situation. He had been humiliated by her behavior, and yet it was she who now had to live with the reality of what she had done. In some ways, he felt pity for her because he knew that this would be a lesson she would never forget, but at the same time he didn't feel the need to offer her forgiveness. He wasn't there to teach her a lesson, he wasn't there to make her feel better for her actions, he was there to conduct his business and nothing more, and so he waited for her to finish the transaction, her nervous energy filling the space. As the minutes dragged on, the entire exchange had lost its sense of normalcy. Everything felt wrong now. There was no professionalism, no respect in the air, only the awkward silence of a mistake that could never be undone. He couldn't help but wonder how many times this had happened, how many people had been treated this way simply because of their appearance, simply because they weren't given a chance to show who they really were. He knew it was a story that was all too common. It was a story he had lived time and time again, and he knew that this moment wasn't going to be the last. But what mattered most was that he was still standing there, unaffected by her assumptions, unaffected by her disrespect, because he knew who he was, and nothing she did could ever change that. But for her this would remain as a reminder of how easily people can be dismissed based on their outward appearance, how often judgment is passed before the truth is ever known, how much more work still needed to be done before these mistakes no longer happened again. And again he looked at her one last time, his gaze steady as he silently acknowledged the lesson that had been learned, though she may not have realized it yet. The teller finished processing the transaction, her hands trembling as she handed the receipt over to the man, her voice now lacking any of the earlier arrogance. It was soft and apologetic, almost as if she were trying to make amends for the mistake she had made. But the man said nothing. He took the receipt from her with the same composed demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. His eyes never left hers, and in that brief moment she could see that he wasn't just disappointed in her, he was unmoved by her attempt at a quick recovery. He had already seen everything he needed to see, and her apology was nothing more than an afterthought to him, a desperate attempt to salvage a situation that had been lost. The air in the bank felt heavy as the man turned and began to walk away, his steps measured and purposeful. The teller watched him go, her heart sinking with each step he took. She knew he wasn't angry, but there was something far worse in the way he had carried himself. Throughout the exchange, he hadn't shown any sign of retaliation, no outburst, no harsh words. He had simply let her actions speak for themselves, and in doing so he had left her to confront the reality of her mistake alone. It wasn't just her professionalism that had failed her, it was the judgment she had passed without a second thought, the way she had allowed her assumptions to cloud her judgment. And in the quiet space that remained after he left, she could feel the weight of her failure pressing in on her. It was a failure that wasn't just about the man at the counter, it was a failure that was deeply personal. It was about how easily she had fallen into the trap of prejudice, and how she had let those assumptions shape her behavior without realizing the consequences. She had no idea who the man was when he walked in, and now she understood just how deeply wrong she had been. But the most painful part wasn't the embarrassment she felt now, it was the realization that the damage she had done to him could never be undone. She couldn't erase the way she had treated him or the thoughts she had allowed to guide her actions. She couldn't go back and offer him the respect he deserved in that moment, but she knew she had to face it and learn from it. She had to acknowledge the truth of what had happened and not let herself forget the lesson that had been taught to her so harshly. She sat down in her chair, staring at the empty space where the man had been only moments before. She couldn't help but replay the scene in her mind over and over again, how she had underestimated him, how she had assumed his worth based on the way he looked. The realization of how easily she had fallen into the trap of seeing people only for what they appeared to be instead of for who they truly were was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was one that would stick with her long after he was gone. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that this wasn't just a mistake about one person. This was about the way society had conditioned her to think about others, to judge based on appearances, to see people as categories to be labeled. But that wasn't who she wanted to be, and in the silence that filled the bank, she made a vow to herself that she would never forget this moment, that she would never forget the man who had come to the counter that day and unknowingly taught her the most valuable lesson of all, about humility, about respect, about seeing beyond the surface, and about understanding the true weight of her actions. As the teller sat in her chair reflecting on the exchange, she couldn't help but feel a sense of shame wash over her. The realization of what had just occurred settled deep in her chest, and for the first time in a long while she questioned the assumptions she had made about people. She had allowed herself to be caught up in stereotypes without even thinking about it, without giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. She had looked at the man who had walked into the bank and immediately judged him based on what she saw. She hadn't taken the time to see him as a person with his own story, his own experiences, and his own worth. She had simply assumed that because he didn't fit the mold of what she expected someone in that position to look like, he didn't deserve her respect. But now she understood how wrong she had been, how deeply flawed her thinking had been, how easily she had let her bias control her actions. As the day wore on, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of the man's calm demeanor, as he stood there waiting silently, had stayed with her. It was clear that he wasn't angry or upset by what had happened, but there was a quiet strength in the way he had handled the situation. He had seen her for what she was, and yet he had chosen not to engage with her at the level she had hoped he would. He had treated her with a grace that she didn't deserve, and that realization only made her feel more uncomfortable. She had been given a chance to show her professionalism, to treat him with the respect that every customer deserved, but instead she had failed him in every way possible. And now she had to live with the consequences of her actions. The next customer who walked up to her counter was an older woman with a friendly smile and a polite greeting. The teller forced herself to focus on the task at hand as she began processing the transaction, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched in a way she hadn't been before. She felt more aware of herself, more conscious of the way she interacted with the people in front of her. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had walked into the bank and had been treated the same way without anyone realizing it, how many others had been dismissed or judged without anyone ever taking the time to see who they really were. She had seen this before in the way people treated her too, the subtle ways they assumed she wasn't capable of handling a difficult task, or that she was just a clerk behind the counter and nothing more, the way they spoke down to her when they thought she wasn't paying attention, and how easily they ignored her presence when they believed she didn't matter. But now the roles had been reversed, and she understood how it felt to be the one on the receiving end of that judgment, how it felt to be reduced to nothing more than a stereotype, a label that others could place on her without even considering who she truly was. And it was uncomfortable. It made her question the way she had been treating people all along. She didn't want to be the kind of person who judged others based on appearances or assumptions. She didn't want to be the kind of person who dismissed others because they didn't fit into a narrow view of what success or worth looked like. She wanted to be better than that, but she knew it wasn't enough to just feel bad about it. She had to do something about it. She had to change her approach to the way she saw the world. She had to challenge the biases she had been carrying around for so long and confront the truth that no one was truly what they appeared to be on the surface, and that everyone had their own value, their own story that deserved to be heard, respected, and understood. The rest of the day passed in a blur as she continued working and trying to keep her focus on the tasks in front of her, but her mind kept drifting back to that one moment with the man who had unknowingly taught her more about herself than she could have imagined. And with each passing customer, she tried harder to make sure she treated them with the same respect she had once denied, that she had once taken for granted. But deep down, she knew it would take more than just a few polite interactions to undo the damage that had been done. It would take a changing mindset, a commitment to seeing beyond the surface, and a willingness to truly understand understand the people she interacted with each day. The next few days were a blur for the teller as she went through the motions of her daily tasks, but in the back of her mind the events of that encounter kept replaying over and over again. The lesson had been learned, but she knew it was one that wouldn't easily leave her. It wasn't just about the man she had wronged, it was about the realization that so many people had likely gone through the same thing, being treated differently because of the way they looked or because of preconceived ideas about their worth. And as she walked into work each day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something more than just learn from the mistake. She needed to change the way she approached her interactions with everyone. No longer would she make snap judgments about people based on how they looked or what she assumed about them. She wanted to be the kind of person who gave others the benefit of the doubt, the kind of person who treated everyone with the respect and dignity they deserved without hesitation. She had already started noticing the small changes in her own behavior. She was more patient with customers, more open-minded when they spoke to her. She didn't rush through conversations or assume that she knew what they needed before they had a chance to explain themselves. And in those small moments, she began to see the difference it made when she didn't allow herself to make assumptions. She saw people in a new light, and it felt right. But she also knew that change would take time. She couldn't just expect to be perfect overnight, and she couldn't expect others to change either, but she could start with herself. She could become more aware of her biases and work to dismantle them piece by piece. And as for the man who had walked into the bank that day, she never saw him again. But she often thought about him and the way he had handled the situation with such quiet dignity. It had left an impression on her, one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She hoped that wherever he was, he had never felt that way again, humiliated or underestimated by someone who didn't take the time to see who he really was. She hoped that he had moved on from the incident without carrying any of the weight that she now carried, knowing that she had treated him with disrespect simply because of how he looked. She had learned that day that true humility comes from recognizing your own mistakes and understanding the impact they have on others. It comes from realizing that everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are and not for the assumptions or biases that others project onto them. And as she continued working day after day, she knew she had made a decision to be better, to be kinder, to be more thoughtful, to challenge her own perceptions, and to never again make the mistake of underestimating someone based on what they looked like or where they came from. She had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. But it was one that she would never forget, because it wasn't just about one man, it was about every person she encountered and the opportunity she had to make them feel seen, to make them feel respected, to show them that they mattered no matter what their circumstances were, no matter what they looked like, no matter what anyone else might assume about them. She had learned the true power of empathy and the importance of not letting judgment cloud your vision, and in the end, she knew that was the most valuable lesson she could ever carry with her.